Okay, our next lecture goes into, well, it's a continuation of population genetics. We've looked at how population can change over time through natural selection due to different environmental pressures that are acted upon the population. That changes can occur, and this can result in microevolution. Again, small scale change, which is just a shifting of existing genes in the population. We looked at some laws that govern that, the Hardy-Weinberg laws, and now we want to look at some examples of that occurring. So this impact of natural selection on a population can have different types of outcomes, of course, but different things can drive this. Um, One example we start with is an example of genetic drift. Now, genetic drift is a change in the gene pool, the genetic makeup of the population due to chance. So this is just the basically the probability of certain genes being passed on. So you carry two alleles or two genes for most of your traits, one from your mother, one from your father, and you have basically a 50-50 chance of passing one of those off to your offspring. So just due to pure chance, we're going to have a change in the genetic frequency or ratio from one generation to the next. Another example is called gene flow. Gene flow differs from gene drift or genetic drift in that this is change in this population due to individuals coming in or leaving the population. So sometimes we'll have individuals that will leave the population. When they leave, they take their genes with them. Or we have some individuals that migrate in or move into this population from another population, and they bring their genes with them. So this is going to change the gene makeup, genetic makeup. Some specific examples of genetic drift. Here's an example here of these flowers, a particular trait of the color of the flower. The dominant trait's red, the recessive trait is white. And you can see there's just a few recessive alleles in the population in this first generation. And in the second generation, there's maybe a few more that are being passed on. But by the third generation, just due to pure chance, they're completely gone. All 10 of these plants have lost that recessive allele. And so this has definitely been an example of microevolution, and we have lost that allele. So it no longer exists in this population. So that is a change in the frequency. Another specific example of genetic drift is called the bottleneck effect. The bottleneck effect is when you have individuals in a population that have died or are lost to the population for one reason or another, generally some kind of disaster that happens, forest fire, overhunting, something like that would cause a bunch of the individuals to die. And when they die, their genes die with them. And so you have the few surviving individuals are now going to make up the new gene pool, the new genetic makeup. And so generally you're going to have a lot of loss of genes that occur during this bottleneck effect. So the analogy is that you have all these individuals here represented by these marbles in this bottle, and then the neck of the bottle is the event, is the disaster, forest fire, whatever. And so only a few individuals survive that disaster and make it through the neck of the bottle, and that's our resulting surviving population. So that's an example of genetic drift, and we'll certainly have a change in genetic makeup. Another example is called the founder effect. This is another form of genetic drift. Founder effect is when certain individuals leave a mainland population or leave a population and colonize or a certain area, particular area, and they no longer breed and interact with that original population. And if this is for a long enough time, they can be considered a new population. and they will have a new resulting gene pool from those individuals. This is an example your book shows of a human population where these individuals left a mainland population and populated and colonized an island. And their population just remained on that island. All started from a few individuals, and these individuals had, when this occurs, very often there's a higher incidence of recessive disorders because you have, well, it can be if you have a few individuals that happen to be carrying a recessive allele, the likelihood of them passing it on to their offspring becomes increased because you have a smaller gene pool. And so that's what's happened in this case. There was a genetic disorder for a retinal disorder with eyes, and so there's a higher incidence of these individuals than from their originating mainland population. Now, this variation that we see in populations is very common. It's very beneficial to the populations to have a lot of variations. If you're a large population, you have a lot of variations, then that's good for the population. If you're small and you do not have as many, it's not as good. Your book makes a connection here about that and endangered species. The connection is that when you have low variability, it can reduce the ability to survive. And so this example, which can create a case of becoming endangered, threatened or endangered or even extinct. This shows an example of the leopards. Leopards here are not very diverse. If you look at all of the variation in leopards across the whole species, you don't see a lot of difference, and they all look very similar. Now, their spot patterns may be slightly different, but they all look very similar, and so they don't adapt to the environment as well. They can't camouflage as well and move into different types of environments, that type thing. And so your book's making the claim that maybe this is why these animals are in danger. And so low variability maybe has a connection to animals becoming endangered. Here's an example of high variability in a species. This is a species of snakes right here, but if you look at them, there's 4 different snakes, but they all look very different, and you would probably think they're 4 different species. But they are what are called polymorphic, and polymorphic means they have different phenotypic or physical characteristics within the population. And so high variability is a phenomenon we see in polyploidy or polymorphism. So it's referred to both ways: polymorphic, meaning many morphic forms, or polyploidy. Polyploidy is when it has 2 full sets of genetic chromosomes, and so that results in polymorphism. Let's see, another variation we see. Sometimes we see variation along a geographical line, and that would mean like in one area you see this particular trait being exhibited, and in this area you see a different trait being exhibited. You see this in birds sometimes. There'll be a southern species and there'll be a northern species, or even a northern variation of the same species. And it may have some slight differences to it. Here's an example your book shows of a plant, the yarrow plant. Down here in lower elevation, this plant grows taller. Up here in higher elevation, it grows shorter. And so that's a variation along a geographical line. And so we see that variation occurring that way sometimes. We see variation within the sexes. This is called sexual selection between males and females, and also called sexual dimorphism. And so we'll see this where often the males and females show very distinctive differences of appearances. So you see this here in the peacock. Male peacock has all these elaborate feathers to try to attract the female. So very often in bird species, you'll see that very, very commonly. But that's a variation between the sexes, between male and female. Okay, and here we see an example. So sometimes we see this variation. So there's lots of variation that we've been talking about within populations, caused by a number of different things and resulting in a number of different outcomes. And but sometimes this variation is very beneficial. We've talked about camouflage in nature being very beneficial, animals able to hide and things like that. And so we see a lot of variation being able to attract a mate and things like that. So variation can be very beneficial. But there's often a lot of variation that we see in nature that doesn't have any really survival benefit to it at all. Sorry about that. So we see that in nature. We see a lot of different plants and animals that have a lot of different colors and variations and things like that. And this just part of the design of nature that we see. And there's really sometimes no benefit to it. Your book uses this example here of fingerprints. So we see in the human population lots of variation there. Every individual has a different fingerprint. So but there's really no survival benefit to that. And so sometimes in nature, we see this in plants and animals, there'll be some benefit for survival, but other times it's just part of the design of nature and we don't really see any benefit to it. Let's see. The last thing we mentioned here is about the outcomes or effects of natural selection. So when natural selection does occur and you have that predator that's attacking that prey and feeding on that prey, it can have a result on that population. It can cause that population to diverge in one way or another. So here's an example of these. We call these the mechanisms of natural selection. Or the outcomes of natural selection. So we start with our original population. Your book gives us an example of these field mice where within this population, one particular variation is different colors of their fur. All right, so you have light color, medium color, and dark color. When predation occurs, and so this natural selection is happening, and you have predation occurring on this population of field mice, say the field cats feeding off of these, and so you can have this population shift in one way or another. In one case, the field mice may be camouflaged if it has a median color. Maybe the light color and the dark color stand out. So again, camouflage, very important trait for survival. So the light color and dark color stand out and the median color survives. We call that stabilizing selection. So after a bunch of generations, you may end up with a population of just primarily median color. You could shift one direction or another, and that's directional selection. That's when, say, the darker colored fur is beneficial and better able to be camouflaged, and the lighter color is weeded out. That's called directional selection. Where the last example is disruptive selection, or sometimes called diversifying selection. That's where kind of your median trait is weeded out and the extreme traits are selected for. So back in our example, we mentioned about the peppered moth that we talked about earlier, a classic example of microevolution and natural selection in action. That would be an example of directional selection. The lighter colored wings were the beneficial trait, and after the pollution got the bark of the trees stained, it moved to the darker trait. So it shifted directionally one direction. After the Industrial Revolution, it actually shifted back to the lighter color. Okay, that's where our lecture ends for this part. We'll begin our next lecture in talking about the process of speciation and some of the barriers that are applied to these populations.